There is a group of people alive today who have been waiting for something for over 2,000 years. They live in scattered communities across Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories. They dress in white. They pray facing the sun. They baptize themselves in flowing water, not once in a lifetime, but repeatedly, sometimes daily, as an act of ongoing purification. They do not eat meat slaughtered by anyone outside their community. They do not enter the cities of the dead. They have their own scriptures, their own priests, their own calendar, their own sacred language, and their own understanding of who John the Baptist was and what he represented that is so different from anything in the Christian or Jewish tradition that it sounds, the first time you hear it, like something from another world entirely. They are called the Mandaeans, and they are one of the oldest continuous religious communities on Earth, a living survival from the world of the Second Temple that has somehow persisted through Roman conquest, Islamic expansion, medieval violence, and modern persecution into the 21st century, carrying with them a tradition that they claim goes back not to Moses and not to Jesus, but to Adam himself. But they are not the subject of this video. They are the reminder. The reminder that the Judaism of the Second Temple period was not the Judaism we know today. It was not a single, unified, doctrinally consistent tradition with agreed scripture and agreed practice. It was an extraordinarily diverse landscape of sects, movements, schools, and communities, each with its own understanding of what God required, who the true priests were, what the temple represented, and whether the temple in Jerusalem was even legitimate at all. Because that is the thing that almost nobody in popular religious education ever says clearly. There were Jewish groups in the Second Temple period who rejected the temple in Jerusalem, not because they had abandoned Judaism, because they believed the temple had been corrupted, that its priests were illegitimate, that its calendar was wrong, that its sacrifices were being conducted by people who had no right to conduct them, that the most sacred institution in the Jewish world had become an instrument of political power rather than divine encounter. And one of those groups left a library in the desert. Welcome to this channel, where ancient secrets meet modern questions. To understand the Jewish sect that rejected the temple, you need to understand what the temple meant in the world of the Second Temple period, because without that understanding, the rejection makes no sense. The temple in Jerusalem was not simply a place of worship in the way that a modern synagogue or church is a place of worship. It was the center of the cosmos. In the theology of Second Temple Judaism, the Jerusalem temple was the place where heaven and earth met, where the presence of God dwelt among the people in a physical, locatable, specific sense. The sacrifices conducted there were not symbolic gestures. They were cosmic acts that maintained the relationship between God and humanity, that atoned for sin in a way that nothing else could, that kept the world functioning as it was meant to function. The temple was also the center of economic and political power in Judea. The high priest was not merely a religious figure. He was one of the most powerful political actors in the region, appointed first by Hellenistic rulers and later by the Romans, controlling the temple treasury, which was one of the largest concentrations of wealth in the ancient Near East, overseeing a vast system of priestly families and Levitical clans whose livelihoods depended entirely on the temple system. This combination of cosmic significance and worldly power created the conditions for corruption that every such combination in human history has created. The high priesthood in the last 2 centuries before the Common Era was bought and sold. Hellenizing Jews who wanted to transform Judaism into a Greek philosophical system purchased the high priesthood from the Seleucid kings. The Hasmonean dynasty that liberated Judea from Seleucid control and is celebrated in the festival of Hanukkah combined the high priesthood with the kingship in a way that many Jews considered theologically illegitimate, since the Hasmoneans were not of the Zadokite priestly line that the Torah prescribed for the high priesthood. And when the Romans arrived and began appointing and deposing high priests according to political convenience, the corruption was complete. Into this environment of institutional corruption and theological crisis came the community that would produce the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered between 1947 and 1956 in caves near the site of Qumran on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. The discovery is one of the most important archaeological finds in the history of religion. Hundreds of manuscripts, some nearly complete, some fragmentary, containing biblical texts 1,000 years older than any previously known manuscripts, along with sectarian documents, legal texts, hymns, and apocalyptic visions that describe the beliefs and practices of the community that produced them. That community, which most scholars identify as the Essenes, was a Jewish sect that had removed itself from Jerusalem and from the temple system in a deliberate, theologically reasoned act of protest and separation. They believed the temple in Jerusalem was defiled. They believed its priests were illegitimate. They believed the calendar by which the temple sacrifices were conducted was wrong, a solar calendar having been replaced by a lunar calendar in a change they considered a cosmic error. And they believed that God had transferred his favor from the corrupt Jerusalem temple to their own community, which they understood as the true Israel, the remnant of the faithful, the community that was keeping the covenant while everyone else had abandoned it. The scholar who has done more than anyone else to illuminate the Qumran community and its relationship to the temple is Lawrence Schiffman of New York University, whose decades of work on the Dead Sea Scrolls has established with considerable clarity the legal and theological framework within which the Essenes operated. What Schiffman's work demonstrates is that the Essenes were not a fringe group of religious eccentrics who had wandered away from the mainstream. They were a sophisticated, legally rigorous, theologically coherent community whose critique of the temple establishment was grounded in the same Torah that the temple priests claimed to be following. The argument was not about whether to follow the Torah, it was about who was following it correctly. The Damascus document, one of the most important sectarian texts found among the Dead Sea Scrolls and known from a copy discovered in a Cairo Geniza in 1896 before the Qumran scrolls were found, describes the founding of the community in terms of a divine intervention. God, seeing the corruption of Israel, raised up a teacher of righteousness, a priestly figure of extraordinary spiritual authority to lead a faithful remnant out of the corrupt system and into a new covenant. The identity of the teacher of righteousness is one of the most debated questions in Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship. He is never named in the texts. He is described in terms of his role and his conflict with a figure called the Wicked Priest, who is almost certainly the Hasmonean high priest of his era, but which specific high priest is disputed. What is clear from the Damascus document and from the other sectarian texts is that the founding of the Qumran community was understood as a second Exodus. Just as God had led Israel out of Egypt and into the wilderness to form a covenant community at Sinai, God was now leading a faithful remnant out of corrupted Israel and into the wilderness of Judea to form a new covenant community that would preserve the true Israel until God acted to restore the proper order. This is a theology of replacement and waiting. The community at Qumran understood itself as the legitimate continuation of Israel, the true priests, the genuine keepers of the covenant, while the temple in Jerusalem and its priests were an illegitimate usurpation. And they were prepared to wait in the desert for as long as God required until the cosmic conflict they saw approaching would result in the destruction of the corrupt establishment and the restoration of the true Israel. The War Scroll, one of the most dramatic documents among the Dead Sea Scrolls, describes this coming conflict in extraordinary detail. It is a military manual for the final war between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness, a cosmic battle that the community expected to happen in their own lifetimes or in the near future. The Sons of Light are the community itself and its angelic allies. The Sons of Darkness are the corrupt Jerusalem establishment, the Romans, and the other nations who have oppressed Israel. The War Scroll describes the battle formations, the inscriptions on the banners, the signals for advance and retreat, the prayers to be recited before and after each engagement, the role of the priests in the battle, and the ultimate outcome, total victory for the Sons of Light after a war lasting 40 years. The 40 years is not accidental. It deliberately echoes the 40 years of wilderness wandering before Israel entered the Promised Land. The community understood its own desert sojourn as a typological recapitulation of the Exodus, waiting in the wilderness for the moment when God would lead them to victory and restore the proper temple worship with the proper priests conducting the proper sacrifices according to the proper calendar. Here is something that almost nobody in popular discussions of the Dead Sea Scrolls talks about. The Qumran community's rejection of the temple was not a rejection of temple worship as such. It was a rejection of this temple at this time with these priests. They did not believe the sacrificial system was wrong. They believed it was being conducted by the wrong people in the wrong way. Their ideal was not a synagogue or a prayer service or a spiritualized form of worship without sacrifice. Their ideal was a purified temple conducted by legitimate Zadokite priests following the correct solar calendar with the proper purity regulations observed. They were not proto-Christians replacing temple sacrifice with faith. They were ultra-Orthodox Jews who believed everyone else had gotten the temple wrong. The community rule, the document that describes the internal organization and practice of the Qumran community, contains a passage that is one of the most important and most debated in all of Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship. It describes the community itself as serving as an atonement for the land in the absence of the temple. The communal meals, the study of the Torah, the prayer, the discipline of the community, all of these are described in language drawn from temple sacrifice, as if the community's life is a substitute, a provisional replacement for the sacrifices that cannot currently be offered in the legitimate way. This is a theological innovation of extraordinary significance. It is the idea that a community of people living in a specific way can perform the function that a temple building and its sacrificial system are supposed to perform. This idea did not stay in the desert at Qumran. It became one of the most consequential theological developments in the history of Western religion. The community at Qumran was destroyed by the Roman army in 68 CE, 2 years before the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. The members hid their library in the caves and fled or were killed. The scrolls stayed in the caves for nearly 2,000 years, but the theological idea that a community of people living in covenant with God and with each other could replace the temple survived. It survived in Rabbinic Judaism. After the destruction of the temple in 70 CE, the rabbis faced the same theological crisis that the Qumran community had faced. How do you maintain a relationship with God when the place where that relationship was supposed to be mediated no longer exists? The rabbinic answer, developed over the centuries that followed, was strikingly similar to the Qumran answer, even though the rabbis and the Qumran community had been theological opponents. Prayer replaces sacrifice. Torah study replaces priestly ritual. The table in the home replaces the altar in the temple. The community gathered around the Torah is the presence of God, not less real for lacking a physical building. And it survived in a different form in early Christianity. The letter to the Hebrews, one of the most theologically sophisticated documents in the New Testament, makes an extended argument that Jesus is the true high priest in the order of Melchizedek, a priest king who predates the Levitical priesthood, and that his sacrifice on the cross was the final perfect sacrifice that renders the Jerusalem temple system permanently obsolete. Whether the author of Hebrews knew the Qumran texts or was independently drawing on the same theological vocabulary is debated. What is clear is that the move being made, replacing a corrupt or obsolete temple system with a new form of divine presence, is structurally identical to the move the Qumran community had been making for 2 centuries. But there is a third group, less well known than either the rabbis or the early Christians, who took the temple rejection theology in a direction that neither of those traditions followed, and that leads to one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of ancient Judaism, the Samaritans. The Samaritans are still here. There are approximately 800 of them living in 2 communities, one on Mount Gerizim near Nablus in the West Bank, and one in Holon near Tel Aviv. They are one of the smallest ethnic and religious communities in the world, and they have one of the most extraordinary claims in the history of religion. They believe they are the true Israel, the keepers of the original Mosaic covenant, and that the Jewish temple in Jerusalem was never the legitimate site of worship at all. The Samaritan claim rests on a textual variant in the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses. In the Hebrew text of Deuteronomy, God commands Israel to worship at the place that God will choose, without specifying which place. In the Samaritan Pentateuch, a version of the Torah that differs from the standard Hebrew text in approximately 6,000 places, the corresponding passage specifies not a future choice, but a past one. The place God has chosen is Mount Gerizim, the mountain above the ancient city of Shechem, where the Samaritans built their own temple in the 5th or 4th century BCE. The conflict between the Jerusalem temple and the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim is one of the bitterest and most long-lasting religious disputes in the history of Judaism. The Jerusalem establishment considered the Samaritans to be heretics at best and apostates at worst, descendants of the foreign populations imported by the Assyrians after the conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE, who had mixed foreign religious practices with Israelite tradition and produced a hybrid religion with no legitimate claim to the covenant. The Samaritans considered themselves to be the authentic continuation of the Mosaic tradition, descendants of the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh who had never been exiled and whose religious practice on Mount Gerizim was older and purer than the Jerusalemite tradition that the returning exiles from Babylon had imported along with their Babylonian-influenced theological innovations. The historian Gary Knoppers of the University of Notre Dame, in his landmark study, Jews and Samaritans, The Origins and History of Their Early Relations, has argued that the standard account of the Samaritan schism, which places its origin in the post-exilic period and attributes it entirely to the corruption of Israelite religion by foreign populations, is an oversimplification driven by the theological interests of the Jerusalem establishment. The Samaritan tradition may preserve genuinely ancient elements of Israelite religion that predate the Jerusalemite synthesis, and the Samaritan Pentateuch may represent an independent textual tradition of equal or greater antiquity than the Masoretic text that became the standard Hebrew Bible. This is not a fringe position. It is the assessment of multiple serious textual scholars who have compared the Samaritan Pentateuch with the Dead Sea Scrolls and found that in many places where the Samaritan text differs from the Masoretic text, the Dead Sea Scrolls align with the Samaritan version, which means the Samaritan reading is sometimes the older reading, which means the text that the Jerusalem tradition used to demonstrate the Samaritans were wrong may itself be the later revised version. The Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim was destroyed by the Hasmonean ruler John Hyrcanus in 128 BCE in an act of religious violence that the Samaritans have never forgotten and never forgiven. They still pray facing Mount Gerizim. They still conduct Passover sacrifices on the mountain, one of the only communities in the world that still slaughters the Passover lamb as the Torah commands, making them simultaneously one of the most ancient and one of the most vivid living connections to the religion of ancient Israel. And then there is the community whose rejection of the temple was the most radical, the most comprehensive, and the most historically consequential of all. A community that rejected not just the corrupt Jerusalem establishment, but the entire sacrificial system, the entire priestly hierarchy, the entire theology of divine presence in a physical building. A community whose teacher said, in words that have echoed across 20 centuries, that the time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem, but in spirit and in truth. That community is the early followers of Jesus of Nazareth, and their relationship to the temple is considerably more complex and more radical than most Christians realize. Jesus's relationship to the temple in the gospel accounts is not simply hostile, it is dialectical. He teaches in the temple, he quotes the temple scriptures, he sends healed lepers to show themselves to the priests, following the Mosaic law, but he also says things about the temple that, in the context of first century Judaism, were explosive beyond measure. In the Gospel of Mark, the earliest of the 4 canonical Gospels, Jesus enters the temple and drives out those who are buying and selling there, overturning the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. This episode, known as the cleansing of the temple, has been interpreted in multiple ways as a protest against commercial exploitation of religion, as an act of prophetic symbolic theater announcing the temple's coming destruction, as a claim to authority over the temple that constituted a direct challenge to the high priestly establishment. What is less often discussed is the saying that Jesus quotes in the course of this action. My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, he says, drawing on Isaiah 56-7. But you have made it a den of robbers. The phrase den of robbers comes from the prophet Jeremiah, from a passage in which Jeremiah stands at the temple gate and announces that God is about to destroy it because the people have made it a refuge for those who commit injustice. The combined quotation is not merely a protest against money changers, it is a prophetic announcement in the language of Isaiah and Jeremiah that the temple is about to be destroyed. And in a private conversation with his disciples shortly afterward, Jesus makes this explicit. One of his disciples points out the magnificence of the temple buildings. Jesus responds, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." This is a prophecy of destruction that came true 40 years later when the Romans demolished the temple in 70 CE, a coincidence that the early Christian community took as confirmation of Jesus' prophetic authority. But here is what the scholars debate and what the popular imagination rarely engages with. Was Jesus predicting the temple's destruction as a prophet announcing divine judgment on a corrupt institution? Or was he announcing it as a participant in a deliberate program to bring it about? The historian John Dominic Crossan, in his reconstruction of the historical Jesus, has argued that the temple action was the direct cause of Jesus' arrest and execution, that the high priestly establishment saw in it an existential threat and moved quickly to eliminate the threat. If Crossan is right, then the crucifixion was not primarily about theology, it was about the temple. It was about who controlled the most powerful institution in Judea and what happened when someone challenged that control in public in Jerusalem at Passover with a crowd watching. The connection between Jesus' movement and the Qumran community is one of the most debated questions in New Testament scholarship, and it is a question that the popular imagination has tended to answer too quickly in both directions. Some have argued that John the Baptist was an Essene, that Jesus was an Essene, that the early Christian movement was essentially an Essene movement that evolved in a specific direction. The serious scholarship is considerably more cautious. There are real similarities: the emphasis on baptism, the communal meal, the expectation of imminent cosmic transformation, the critique of the temple establishment, the use of the teacher of righteousness figure in the scrolls as a precursor to the messianic figure. But there are also real differences. The Essenes were rigidly exclusive, the early Jesus movement was explicitly inclusive. The Essenes maintained strict purity regulations. Jesus was notorious for associating with the ritually impure. The Essenes waited in the desert for God to act. Jesus went to Jerusalem and acted. What the comparison reveals is not that Jesus was an Essene, but that both communities were responding to the same crisis, the corruption of the temple establishment, with different but structurally related solutions. The Qumran community's solution was withdrawal and waiting. Jesus' solution was confrontation and transformation. And here is the thing that ties all of these threads together. The Qumran community, the Samaritans, the early Christians, and the later rabbis, the thing that nobody in popular religious education ever says clearly enough. All of them were right about the temple being corrupt. The high priesthood in the Second Temple period was genuinely corrupt, genuinely politicized, genuinely compromised by the demands of foreign rulers and the temptations of worldly power. The criticism that each of these groups directed at the temple establishment was grounded in real and documented abuses. The Hasmonean combination of high priest and king was theologically irregular. The appointment of high priests by Roman governors for political reasons was a desecration of the office. The commercial operation in the temple precincts was an exploitation of pilgrims. The wealth and power of the high priestly families in a context of widespread poverty was a living contradiction of the prophetic tradition they claimed to represent. All four of these movements, the Essenes, the Samaritans, the Jesus movement, and Rabbinic Judaism, emerged as responses to a genuine institutional crisis. And all four of them, in different ways, developed theological innovations that allowed Judaism and its offshoots to survive the destruction of the institution that had been their center. The Essenes developed the idea of a community as a substitute temple. The Samaritans maintained their alternative sacred mountain. The early Christians developed the theology of Christ as the ultimate sacrifice that renders the temple system obsolete. And the rabbis developed the theology of Torah study and prayer as the functional equivalent of temple worship. Without the crisis of the Second Temple period, without the corruption that drove multiple Jewish groups to seek alternatives to the Jerusalem establishment, none of these developments might have happened. And without those developments, the three Abrahamic traditions might not exist in the forms we know them. The destruction of the temple in 70 CE was a catastrophe by any measure, but it was a catastrophe that had already been anticipated, prepared for, and partially preempted by communities who had been living without the temple theologically and practically for over a century before the Romans burned it down. The people who had rejected the temple, who had called it corrupt, who had built alternative systems of divine encounter in the desert and on the mountain and in the gathered community and in the text, those people were the ones who survived. Not because they were right about everything, but because they had done the theological work of imagining what Judaism could be without the building at the center. And that work, done in crisis, under persecution, in the desert, and in the scattered communities of the diaspora, produced something that no temple built by human hands could produce. A religion that does not need a building to survive. A tradition that carries its sacred center not in stone and gold, but in text and practice and memory and community. A faith that has outlasted every empire that ever tried to destroy it precisely because it learned in the Second Temple period how to exist without the thing it loved most. Here is the question I want to leave you with. The Qumran community looked at the most powerful religious institution of their world, an institution that commanded the spiritual loyalty of millions of people and the political backing of Rome itself, and said, "This is wrong. We will not participate in this. We will go into the desert and build something true, even if nobody notices, even if we die here, even if what we build never becomes what we hoped it would be." They were destroyed, their community was burned, their members were killed or scattered, and their library sat in caves by the Dead Sea for 2,000 years. And then a shepherd threw a stone into a cave and heard something break. And the words they had written in the desert, the words they had copied in the belief that they were preserving something worth preserving, were read again 2,000 years later by scholars who had the tools to understand them and a world that needed perhaps more than it knew to hear what they had to say. What do you do when the institution that is supposed to mediate your relationship with the sacred has been corrupted by the same forces that corrupt everything else? When the building where God is supposed to dwell has become a place where power is exercised and money is made and the poor are exploited and the genuine seekers are pushed to the margins? The communities of the Second Temple period gave 4 different answers to that question, and all 4 of those answers are still with us, still shaping the world, still producing the argument about where the sacred is and who gets to tend it and what it means to keep faith when the institution fails. The argument is not over. It never was.